This is the Vanguard podcast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Gavin.
And today we're super excited to be joined by a professor of law at University of California, Hastings, Veena Dubal. How's it going today, Professor?
Thanks for having me. It's going well.
So obviously we wanted to talk to you about the ramifications of the passage of Prop 22. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how I first came across your work. Was actually an essay that you wrote a while back called The Time Politics of Home-Based Digital Piecework. And there's also an excellent condensed version, I believe, that was published in Dissent magazine that we can link to below because everybody should check it out. It was a great piece. And in that, you sort of draw the comparison of women of the early 20th century and the Gilded Age who participated in the piecework economy to those people today who are doing contracted work for Amazon, like data processing at MTurk. And you aptly quoted Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, I believe, at the beginning, essentially underlining the fact that any of these, New Deal era victories that were fought so hard for in the 30s have essentially eroded and now no longer apply to the modern day economy. I'm wondering if you could help articulate to people that the gig economy is actually much broader than just Uber and Lyft, which is what we might commonly associate with it. Could you talk about how it expands far from beyond the service economy into big tech in ways that we might not recognize?
Absolutely. And I'm really fighting against the idea of even talking about a gig economy because it's not a sector, it is a labor practice. And really, it could be any of our jobs, right? Like any one of us could be paid through piecework. I could be paid through piecework. In fact, adjunct professors are in a way paid through piecework. It is casual contingent labor. But when we traditionally think of gig work, because over the past 7 years, people have adapted Uber and Lyft into their lifestyle, and the companies themselves have really embraced this term, the gig economy, to help define themselves and to pass laws that benefit them. Uber and Lyft is essentially piecework. It's companies that are engaging in regulatory arbitrage, so they don't have to pay things like the minimum wage, overtime compensation, unemployment insurance, and workers' comp to the people who create value for the company. It is true also that, and this is such a critical piece of information, that people who think about the so-called quote unquote future of work or technological advancements, all these sort of buzz terms, they don't realize that most of the time that goes into shifting technologies, particularly in the world of AI, is done spent by people who are laboring as data processors. Those are the people who are labeling images, who are sorting images, who some of whom are grabbing images from different websites, even the people that are collecting the images. And most of these people are being paid by the piece. So just like Uber and Lyft drivers are only being paid for the ride itself, the people who do this are only being paid if they're working via Amazon Mechanical Turk or a similar company. They're only being paid for each image that they label, and that they are being paid a fraction sometimes a fraction of a cent or a few cents for every image that they label, and it ends up amounting to, in the US, about $2 an hour. And because of the cultural competency involved in some of this work and the English language skills, etc., this work is performed not by people, just in the global South, but by people in the US. So AMT workers, Amazon Mechanical Turk workers are home workers, many of whom are in the US and in India because of the English language skills required. Again, and we know in the US that they're making less than a third of the federal minimum wage. So on average, about $2 an hour.
Yeah, and I just wanted to extrapolate from there and talk about Prop 22. Obviously, we talked about in a previous piece for the Vanguard, after Uber acquired Postmates, as kind of a show of strength and a consolidation in order to, kind of push this legislation through at a time when, there was a lot of actual frustration even at the state level with these companies because, as you mentioned when we spoke, these are companies that should be paying into things like unemployment benefits and things that taxes that should be going to the state so that they can take care of people when disasters like this one strike. However, when Prop 22 was presented, it was presented pretty narrowly as a like, oh, this is going to be affecting Uber drivers, this is going to be
Right.
affecting Lyft drivers, and obviously that was largely because of the $200 million that was used in essentially peddling propaganda by these massive tech firms. Could you talk about how now that these workers obviously no longer have to be classified as workers, that this will affect not just Uber drivers but everyone else, and kind of what ramifications we have to deal with now that Prop 22 passed?
Yeah, it's as I've said before, the most dangerous law that I've seen in my own lifetime, most dangerous labor law that I've seen in my lifetime. And I still feel, sick to my stomach that it passed. And before I even go into Prop 22, I just want to say to those who are watching or listening that the system of employment rights that we have in the U.S. are so limited. They are really limited. For many, many years, we've been fighting to raise the federal minimum wage. We've been fighting for something better than overtime compensation, something better than unemployment insurance, which is so hard to get. We have such a limited array of regime of employment rights in this country, and that we're having to defend those limited rights is particularly gut wrenching. And in California, what Prop 22 does is take away all of the rights that workers have, these very limited rights that workers have, and that too, taking them away from the most low wage people of color workforce, so the most vulnerable and marginal workforce, taking them away and calling them something that they're not, which is an independent contractor. So independent contractors, independent small business person typically sets their own prices. They decide when and where to work. They are able to sort of advertise and quote unquote hustle to make a living. And Uber and Lyft drivers, Instacart workers, DoorDash workers, Postmates workers, these people cannot do any of that. Their prices are set by the companies. They are told when and where to go to make a living, and those people are no longer paid, are not required to be paid by the time that they work. So now you can legally do work in California and for these companies and actually go home in debt, and you are that's on you. The interesting thing, as you alluded to in your question, is that this does not just apply to Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and Instacart workers. For the first time ever, there is two new categories of workers in California: transportation network company workers and delivery network company workers. And these laws were written such that new companies and old companies, in logistics in particular, can now be formulated to fit this definition, and those people no longer have to pay their workers a living wage. So, for example, if you are a warehouse worker and they make it so that you are doing any part of delivery or any aspect of delivery, you are a delivery network worker that can be dispatched by an app and no longer get the minimum wage, no longer get workers' compensation, and what is considered one of the most dangerous jobs in America. So if you're injured, you and your family are, shit out of luck. This really will give Amazon the opportunity, and I haven't heard anyone talk about this, but give Amazon the opportunity to really establish a monopoly hold in logistics, where they already have a growing share of the market. The Teamsters have long represented UPS drivers, and FedEx has been the big competitor for them. And FedEx is, this terrible company that has long in litigation against their own drivers, who they claim are franchisees. And what this legislation does is it kind of makes all of that go away. I mean, you can now just say that you have a delivery network driver, dispatch your workers by app instead of having to have a payroll. And there you go. The workers are then bearing all of the risk and liability of business. It's so scary and so dangerous, and it's going to spread, because what happens in California tends to spread all over the world. Uber and Lyft started in California, and within months, I remember in 2000, I think it was 2014, when I was talking in a conference in San Francisco called a sharing conference. I don't know why they invited me, but I was critical of the companies, and I thought people were going to throw things at me. Like, there was such palpable anger in the room as I critiqued this business model, and it spread very quickly. And no one wanted to hear any kind of criticism of what was going to happen, and what eventually did happen. And I'm worried that this is going to spread. They're already working on federal legislation, and now that is similar to what they got in California. They're starting the same campaign in New York. I believe they're also doing it in Illinois, and these are just the places where we know it's happening. And they have a blueprint for how to do it. You pour $200 million into an election. You lie about what people who are voting on the law or to the legislator, and you engage in a massive misinformation advertising campaign, and you harass your critics, and you get what you want, and that's American lawmaking. So it's quite frightening. Really, it keeps me up at night.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And something else that I wanted to get your opinion on, Professor, that I think is also another aspect of this kind of burgeoning online or gig economy type model or market that we really see emerging. And I think especially we see emerging during the times of the pandemic is like the OnlyFans thing. And I feel like this isn't quite getting as much coverage as maybe it should be. But like, I was just wondering how you would consider the OnlyFans business model in relation to other jobs like Uber. Do you think it's exploitative to
Can you tell me more? I'm not familiar with OnlyFans.
It's basically like the intersection of like sex work. Like, people can just upload like photos of themselves or videos, and they get paid. Like, it's like a monthly subscription thing. It's become really popular in like the pandemic, and a lot of people. So if you don't know much about it, that's cool. You don't have to comment on it.
Can I just look it up? It sounds so interesting.
Yeah,
maybe you can edit this out as I look it up.
No problem at all. Yeah, it's kind of like,
essentially the cross between like Patreon and Pornhub, right? It's like a lot of typically women, who may find themselves displaced because of the economy, or just by their own, choice, if that was the case. But we've seen there's been a dramatic rise in people who have gone to this line of work simply because the economy has kind of thrust them to, and it would put them in the position of being gig workers. However, there's no real kind of organizing. There's no real sort of
they're like, they're similar. They're content creators who are. It's so interesting. And so they get paid. They basically, it's like Patreon in so much as like you pay a monthly subscription and you have access to all of their things.
Yes. And then there's a fee taken by the overhead company, right?
And for a lot of people, I think it's like really empowering, because they're making a lot of money. And they have to, go to work at McDonald's or Walmart or whatever. They can just buy this way. But as Zach mentioned, I think it is driving some people to do that might not otherwise have gone that route if they were able to get a good job or receive a guaranteed income or whatever we might be looking for.
Absolutely. And the social and cultural implications of content creation and this whole sort of category of worker, of influencer, is really interesting because it has implications for how we think about work and what work is, and how that kind of thing should be remunerated, or what kind of safety net protections these people might have. I'm not familiar with on OnlyFans. I'm not familiar with sort of the rules and regulations that they have, or the ways in which the algorithms might influence who is getting more, subscriptions or customers than other people. But for YouTube influencers, sort of a similar situation. For YouTube influencers, they have so many complaints with YouTube, so many complaints about how they are able to monetize their material, and to the extent that many of them have gone from seeing themselves as these sort of independent, free, flexible creators who are small business people and who are hustling, to thinking of YouTube as an employer as YouTube gets more and more controlling. So it's not just, and in Germany, in fact, there's a YouTubers union that you might be familiar with that is affiliated with IG Metall, which is the biggest union in Germany. And I'm not familiar with OnlyFans, but I think that more people are going to this type of work, certainly during the pandemic, because it's taken so long to get their checks. For a lot of people who are already doing independent contractor work like Uber and Lyft drivers, their checks are much smaller than they should have been as a result of how pandemic unemployment assistance has been calculated. And now we're all sitting in a situation where we're like, oh my God, is another stimulus bill going to be passed? And many people, I'm certain, are thinking really creatively about how to monetize their whatever it is that they have in order to make money. I'm certain that there are really interesting, valuable, powerful things that come out of work like this. I'm sure if you interview some of these women, that they maybe they identify as now as sex workers, and that there's some really empowering aspect of that, and they might feel camaraderie with other types of sex workers or content creators or what have you. But there are power dynamics between platform companies and workers who work on those platform companies, and just because it's happening on the through the internet doesn't mean that those don't exist. They're just much more invisible. And so, someone like you or I who might subscribe to someone on OnlyFans, we don't even know, and the creators don't know, what are the algorithms that are allowing some people to be successful and some people not to be successful, and those things are shifting every day. And because of the information asymmetry between the workers and the workers and the platforms, it creates another really precarious situation where, again, you're not dealing with independent contractors, because those independent contractors are so heavily dependent on the platform itself, the company itself.
What's your thinking on a universal basic income or a guaranteed income to kind of mitigate some of these effects of people having to rely really hardcore on their employer, gig-based employer for things like healthcare or a basic, enough money to keep them afloat while they might be, because, on the surface level, it sounds like a pretty cool thing, like Uber, you can set your own hours. You don't have to, wake up at 8 o'clock. You can take your lunch break whenever, and I've had conversations with Uber drivers where they talk about, how they enjoy those aspects of the job. So I feel like, there's potential for these companies and their business models to maybe be a little bit more successful in, with a more robust welfare state. But obviously we also don't want to just offload all of the, corporate responsibility onto the taxpayer. So just what's your thinking on that?
It's a great question. And it's one that I've struggled with a lot over the years. And the things that come to mind when I talk about the universal basic income are, one, that the conversation often does exactly what you're saying. It offsets the discussion about corporate responsibility. So you don't have to talk about companies paying their taxes. You don't have to talk about companies paying a minimum wage or overtime compensation. It totally displaces that discussion, and that's when this conversation is brought up in a regulatory capacity. When it's brought up in California, it's often brought up by tech companies, because this helps their business model when my taxes increase, so that there's a universal basic income, but corporate taxes don't increase, and of course, that's where we need to be taxing. We need to be taxing these companies in robust ways, and helping close the loopholes that allow them to not pay the kinds of taxes they need to be paying. So that's one thing, is that I'm so worried that UBI will make it so that companies like Uber and Lyft can say, well, look, we don't have to pay workers anything that their labor is worth, because look, they have this income. I also worry about what it might do to the potential for worker organizing. We're at a point in where there's like such extraordinary inequality in the U.S. and all over the world, and workers are going to play a big role in the coming years and fighting back against that. And I worry about what a UBI might do to that potential for social change. I also think that it might incentivize and make invisible the work of the poor in the global South, in so much as if it is a true basic income, then a lot of the most low wage work can be done by people elsewhere, and then that really creates we already live in a really disparate world, but it sort of exaggerates that the sort of global inequalities and the way that work is performed in the industrial economy. So, like on the face of things, I think it is interesting, and I want to continue to think about it. And I do continue to have these kinds of discussions with colleagues, but I have some real hesitations about, in reality, what might happen if there is a UBI in the U.S. And then I don't feel the same thing. Like, I feel like there are ways to establish a social wage that maybe gets around some of these issues. I don't know, but I do know that regardless of whether or not there is a UBI or some kind of social wage, that the aspects of gig work that you're describing that people like, I mean, who wants a boss? I don't want a boss. That's why I'm an academic. No one wants a boss. Like, the existing employment system that we have in the US, the traditional employment system, is oppressive. It is based in a master-servant relationship, and no one wants to be a servant. And so one way in which they have avoided this in the gig economy, or at least made people feel more free initially. Veteran drivers will tell you something very different about their freedom and flexibility, but something that people really like, the alleged control over their time, which I can dispute a little bit. That is something that economists have found just in the last few weeks with studies, that not only is it not tied to employment explicitly, there's nothing about the law that says that you can't have a flexible schedule, but it also doesn't as a business model doesn't preclude employment. So Michael Reich at UC Berkeley came out with a study that showed that Uber and Lyft in California could pay their workers a minimum wage, offer workers' compensation, continue to provide a quote unquote flexible schedule. And I say it's not really flexible because they tell you at the beginning of the week when you need to work in order to make money. They send you this email that says, oh, if you work in these, this is when you're going to make money. And if you don't work in those times and you work at 2 a.m., you end up losing money driving around. But that it is possible, there's really this dichotomy between flexibility and secure wages is an invention of capital. You can have flexibility and secure wages. And one of the things that I was really fighting for before Prop 22 was to grow the panoply of protections for workers in the United States and create legislation that gave workers a right to their own schedule. I mean, the right to time, that's what we all want, is a right to control over our own lives. If we live transnational lives, we have families to take care of. We want to be able to leave work and take care of our sick kid if we get a call from the school and not worry about getting fired in the process. And things like that are possible without getting rid of flexibility.
Yeah, I think that's 100% accurate. I think that, this is all indicative of a larger shift in business, kind of that you were alluding to, especially in Silicon Valley, right? In your paper, you refer to a quote by Jeff Bezos where he's kind of boasting of the new humans as a service platform, right? As if this is some sort of like thing to aspire to. And, that kind of gives me flashbacks to my brief stint in business school and undergrad, and, professors, sort of gleefully describing, you're going to be your own brand, you're your own commodity. Like, this is like something to aspire to. This is the market of the 21st century, right? This is kind of the horseshit that they peddle you if you go to business school. And, to follow along the same lines, you had a quote that said, that this is representing a shift back to an earlier version of U.S. capitalism that has been disguised by a rhetoric of technological advancement and innovation. So I think that you're totally right in the assessment that, that there are so many things that are tremendously beneficial to these workers that, but it's also tremendously beneficial to the employees, or employers, excuse me. So I'm wondering, how do we, leverage that power that these workers do have into creating a situation where, obviously under capitalism, you're not going to be able to perfectly escape this sort of exploiter or exploitee dynamic, but how can we mitigate it to, something that we're at least societally comfortable with on a broad scale, using the power dynamics at play here?
Yeah. So two things. One, just to sort of respond to the earlier comments that you made, I often think like if people really it's hard. Sometimes it's hard when you're in a situation to really see the situation for what it is. But I don't know where you guys live, but I live very close to Silicon Valley, and
We're in Kansas City.
oh, okay. So I live in the peninsula, which is just in between San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and the dichotomy between the way that internal employees and executives live versus how these workers who are creating the value for the companies that are actually doing the work live is something out of a Charles Dickens novel. I mean, it is really, really stark.
And the other thing that you notice, and I did, and full disclosure, like I worked at a startup for a little bit of time when I was in college, and you get really like firsthand exposure into how fucked up capitalism can be, right? Because you have one dude who's like a bajillionaire and he's the boss, and then he hires a bunch of people that he pays 50 grand and 0.0025% equity, telling them that they're going to get rich as soon as he sells this for $1 billion, and then this is the whole startup. But then you have a bunch of these people who are really doing the work and they're getting paid like a pittance compared to the people who have all of the value. But then you also have another layer of employment, which is like techs in Lagos who are doing a lot of the cloud architecture and a lot of really complicated stuff. And these are people who are college educated and elite engineers, and they're doing work for essentially what I was getting paid as an intern for this company when I was there. And so it's all very stark and in your face. And
it's so messed up. I went to I had a little taste of it. I went to elite schools and live a very comfortable life, and went to know people who work at these companies, and I went to a industry like conference, a couple of day conference that I was invited to, although everyone was like very upset that I was there. And I sort of went as an ethnographic experience, and I largely left because people would not talk because I was there. But it was gig companies, and I have never, I'm very middle class, even upper middle class. I like live a very comfortable life, and I have never seen wealth like that. I have ever seen wealth like that.
And it always attracts greed of the same degree.
It was just so striking to me, especially because I spend all of my time, I'm an ethnographer, so my methodology is that I spend most of my time with Uber and Lyft drivers, and just the stark difference in the way that people spend their time, and like just the amount of money that was spent on food and drink and the hotel, and the hotel floors were heated, and it was all so very nice. I mean, it was amazing, and really like sort of gave me a window into how people, what the kind of wealth that has been created by these workers, what it really looks like. And in the meantime, I work with drivers who sleep in their cars, literally, who are, I have a friend who's been, she and her partner, both of whom are gig workers, are hopping from campsite to campsite during the pandemic because they are both unhoused and haven't been able to secure we're in a housing total disaster in the Bay Area, and they haven't been able to get a home. And these are people also, interestingly, who have some education. Like they're not, and white, like a lot of cultural capital, and yet it's still very, very hard, increasingly hard for working people in this country to just get by. I don't know, again, if you guys have been to the Bay Area in the last decade, but things between 2000 and I would say 10 and 2015 just shifted dramatically with the influx of tech money and venture capital. And you're really seeing the results of that right now. So, largely because we're in a pandemic, but also because we are living with such stark inequality in the Bay Area. The homeless situation in San Francisco and Oakland in the East Bay, it's like nothing I've ever seen before. It looks like I'm in Bombay, along the highways, along the train tracks, at like the tent encampments around my university. They're whole communities of people. It's not just a few unhoused people here. There are whole communities of people that are forming in tent communities around the Bay Area. And again, this is directly as a result of these business models. I mean, I think you can draw a line from point A to point B in terms of cause and effect. And yet we had Prop 22 pass, which just cements this economic situation. And it doesn't take a PhD or years researching this to get it. There is a direct relationship between workers being paid nothing and the very palpable rise in inequality all around us. And it's just like so striking to me that that people aren't enraged. And I'm sorry, your other question before I get to your question, your other question about like what we can do about it is like organize, certainly regulations and laws. I have a little bit of an anarchist streak in me, but
hey, I've got David Graeber right behind me.
Yeah, I do believe in in regulation and laws, and I think like that is the way to go. But we didn't get AB5 in California because there were well-meaning legislative decisions that were made. We made it because the workers rose up, and it was not a coincidence that for the first time you had a group of people who were the first in the U.S. That were independently organizing just Uber and Lyft drivers in California. They were drivers themselves, and they were growing really, really, really fast. And it was their direct actions, it was their strikes, it was their protests, it was all them marching to demand higher wages and a secure living that got that law passed. And the companies just threw shit at them with Prop 22.
Yeah. Well, that's all the questions I had. Zach, did you have anything else?
Yeah, sorry. Just one more question for you. I want to be sure that we are respectful of your time. Veena, I just had a question about Massachusetts, which seems to be like the next battleground for Uber and Lyft before we have you go. Massachusetts passed similar legislation to California before Prop 22, essentially shockingly demanding that Uber and Postmates classify their workers as workers.
Yeah.
However, as far as I know, Uber isn't doling out vision and dental packages in Boston. So what allows these companies to essentially give the laws the finger? And just, especially in a pandemic when the tax dollars that the people of Massachusetts specifically voted on are so desperately needed. You look at the week after Christmas is when all of the state, unemployment extension benefits expire. Obviously, the $600 expended long ago, but there's still a lot of families that are relying on the paltry benefits that still do hang on. So I'm just wondering, as a law professor, like how do they manage this?
Well, I think that they just throw a lot of money at it. And unfortunately, that's how laws work in the US. They've thrown an incredible amount of money at, and when I say that they throw money, I don't just mean that they are like paying politicians. They in California, they did the same thing. If there was ever a politician that dared stand up to them in any way, shape, or form, we had a politician in Oakland, Rebecca Kaplan, who stood up and I think she introduced some kind of like small tax on Uber and Lyft just in Oakland, and they invested millions of dollars in her opponent. I mean,
it's the same thing that they did with the city council race in Seattle, right? With Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean that, so they go after anyone who dares try and regulate them. They and not just politicians, but also critics. So I'm sure you have read that I like got they launched an investigation into me. I'm a public employee, and so they sent a Public Records Act request to my university asking for thousands of emails and text messages between me and 140 other people. You know, there was a number of really crazy articles written about me in the right-wing media that I mean, why would anyone rile? I'm like not, you know, I'm not like I'm Kim Kardashian. I don't know why anyone would be interested in me, but it's, you know, I think I can't directly tie it to these companies, but it makes sense that they would be motivated to do stuff like that. I mean, they just, they throw money, every way they can to get their way. It's like, I mean, it's sleazy and it's gross. And what's even weirder is that they've never made a profit. So this is venture capital money that they're spending. Some of it is debt, most of it is venture capital money, and they still haven't made a profit throughout all of this misclassification, all of this regulatory
Isn't that part of their game
arbitrage.
though, right? They don't make any profit so that they can expand market share and also not pay any taxes.
Yep. I mean, that is definitely part of their game. But I don't see how they're going to get out of it. And unlike Amazon was, you know, Amazon, I think sort of famously pioneered this model in some way. And it was clear how Amazon was eventually going to get out of it. And with these companies, it's just unclear. You know, their end game was self-driving cars, and Uber has famously divested from self-driving cars because it
your
just
piece
didn't
you
seem
said
like it was
half a century, if I'm not mistaken, right? That's kind of throws a fucking wrench in the whole. We're already in the third inning, Andrew Yang.
That's what the executives who are being honest are saying. Like that's what Volkswagen has been saying. Like, you know, if you listen to Dara Khosrowshahi, he said, "Oh, like we're going to do it next year," but he also said we would have flying taxis by this year. So there's like a lot of you know, forgive my language, but just like a lot of bullshit that goes into what these people say. I mean, and I just because I'll just say this because I think about it all the time. There was an interview that a live interview that Professor Galloway and another person did on a famous tech blog of Dara Khosrowshahi during the Prop 22 fight, and right after he wrote that editorial that was full of crap in the New York Times, and he was saying how he really wanted to do better for the workers and really wanted to just improve working conditions. And literally 2 seconds later, he said, "But you know, we'll have self-driving cars in 3 or 4 years." And I mean, that's not happening, but that moving so quickly and easily between one lie to the next and having those lies be contradictory was just such a golden moment in tech interviewing. It was really, you know, he didn't bat an eye. He just like literally went from one lie to another, and no one noticed that it was, you know, the interviewers didn't notice that it was these were contradictory statements. But I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with these companies. It's going to take, if they do eventually turn a profit, I think it's going to take raising prices a lot, more than they have right now, and which was always the case, and continuing to exploit workers.
Sounds like the racket of the American economy. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a wonderful conversation, and we're so grateful that you took the time to chat with us.
Thank you so much for your questions and for doing this work, and I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. We really appreciate it. Have a great one.
Take care. Bye-bye.